I might just also say 20 seconds about Victoria because I met her in spring. We did an event together like this in London, and if you think it's appropriate, just 30 seconds, just say hello.
I would just ask you, don't speak very fast because we will have this translation, online translation.
Yeah.
So our translator could translate it good enough.
I just met the guy in the booth.
Yeah.
I said he's going to earn his money today.
And can we take you back?
Yeah, sure. Like just put it behind that. Sorry.
You know, we say in Ukraine, if you sit between people with the same name, you can make the wish. So you're between Svetlanas, you can make the wish.
Okay. Thank you. Is that okay? Thanks. Do I need this?
I think you will need it because we will speak Ukrainian.
It's July 7, Ukraine Mediacentr Укрінформ continues its operation. My name is Світлана Тараторіна, and now we will have a presentation of the book by Люк Гардінґ, which is called Invasion, Russia's Bloody War and Ukraine's Fight for Survival. Joining us in this studio is the author of the book, Люк Гардінґ, writer, Guardian foreign correspondent, and Світлана Тараторіна, communications director at Vivat editorial.
I think you have your personal reasons to dislike Putin and Russia because you were the first British journalist who was deported by Russia in 2011. But I think you understood much earlier that Russia is not democratic but a totalitarian state and Putin is a dictator, didn't you?
Hello, and very nice to be here with everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I just wanted to begin by saying how sad and sorry I am at the death of Victoria Amelina. We did an event together in London in spring at the London Book Fair, a bit like this, talking about Ukrainian writing, Ukrainian literature during the wartime. And I would just like to pass my condolences to her friends, very many friends and family. Just in answer to your question, I was the Moscow bureau chief for The Guardian for 4 years, from 2007 until 2011, when the FSB spy agency basically kicked me out of the country and cancelled my visa. And what was clear to me, I mean, I came to Russia with no kind of backstory, was that in public, Russia pretended to be a democracy, but the reality was, as you say, it was a kind of darkening totalitarian state. And for me, it was a bit like being in a bad spy thriller. So not John le Carré, not a good spy thriller, but a terrible, hackneyed, cliched novel where strange young men in black leather jackets would follow me around, where my apartment was bugged, where I lived with my family and my 2 small children, and where I was told by grey Russian foreign ministry officials that that my reporting was very unpopular and maybe something would happen to my family if I carried on doing that.
Yeah, I see. And I think now we can call you a friend of Ukraine because you were here from the first day of the war on February 24 last year. You were in Kyiv, and now this book it's in Ukrainian translation. So tell us, please, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I've been coming to Ukraine for about 15 years, and based on what I knew about Moscow and the fact that Putin really lives in this kind of fantastical world where he doesn't have access to real information. It's fantasy based on intelligence reports, based on anti-American conspiracy theories, based on a completely paranoid view of the world. So when in autumn of 2021 I saw this buildup of Russian tanks and troops on Ukraine's borders, I was certain this meant a large-scale military operation. I didn't know whether it would be east or north or south, but I came back to Ukraine. I spent December of 2021, I spent with Ukrainian troops on the front line outside Avdiivka. In January, I went to Mariupol and spent time with civil society activists there. And February the 24th, I was just up the road by Golden Gate in the Radisson Hotel. And it's the beginning of my book. Andrei Kurkov, the great Ukrainian novelist, a wonderful, brilliant, humane guy, invited me for borscht. I was late. I got a bottle of wine. I went down Yaroslava Val, past women selling tulips from buckets, people playing violin, busking. And I was very pessimistic. Kurkov is one of life's optimists. He thought it was all probably going to be okay. And I came out after the dinner party. We kind of hugged each other, hugged his wife, went into the street. And I took a call from a contact of mine, a friend of mine who had worked in a senior position at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, who basically said, the invasion will begin at 4 a.m. And so I went back to my hotel. I couldn't sleep, of course. Then, sure enough, as everybody in this room remembers, 4:30, there were the first explosions on the gates of Kiev. And it was clear that Russian troops were coming in huge numbers to seize the capital. My head was spinning. I was thinking about geopolitics, I was thinking about international relations, and then sitting in the bomb shelter about 6 in the morning, a mum came in with 2 small children holding colouring books, and they sat on a couple of chairs right in front of me and started filling them in. And it was at that point that the horror of what was happening hit me, that this war was not a war ultimately about politics, it was a war about people, and that many Ukrainian civilians were going to die in the kind of brutal military campaign that Russia was unleashing. And that was when I decided to write the book. I decided I wanted to tell the big story, the macro story about how the world had changed forever, but also really to tell the stories of Ukrainian civilians, of mothers, of children, of sons, of grandparents who were caught up in this terrible conflict, who were on the front line, and many of whom have died.
How was this book created? Did you have the whole idea from the start, or maybe it transformed from time to time and during your meetings with people, during all this creation way?
I mean, I've written a lot of books. I mean, I think 8 or 9. And I guess they've been quite successful. 2 of them have been made into Hollywood films. One of them was made about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, Russian dissident in London, was made into a play, a very successful play. And I tend to write my books, I mean, they're non-fiction, but I try to write them kind of novelistically, to tell a story in a exciting, dramatic, and compelling way. But also with this story, I had this kind of huge, burning need to put words on the page, because I would come back, say, from, I came back for a brief break in April of last year, having been to Bucha, having been to Kiev region, to Gostomel, to Borodyanka, and having talked to people about how their loved ones were taken away by Russians, interrogated in dark basements, and then executed. And I felt a kind of fury, but I also felt that I needed to kind of tell the world about this. I mean, of course, people were watching news reports, but it's not quite the same. So I sat at home, I would write for 3 weeks, like someone possessed, typing as fast as I could. I'd write 1 chapter, 2 chapters, then I'd go back, I'd report from Ukraine for another month, talking to people, going everywhere. I've been, last autumn I was in Kharkiv Oblast, in Izum, in Kupiansk. When Kherson was liberated, I was in the Oblast and then in Kherson itself, with soldiers, with civilians, where there are booms and there are rumbles, tales of heroism and loss. And I put them all into a book, and I wrote about Mariupol. I mean, one story still haunts me of one of the defenders of Azovstal who called me, I think in March during the siege, saying, can you get my family out? There's no hope for me, but can you get my family out? And I was hundreds of kilometers away, the other side of the country, and I said, look, there's nothing I can do. And I kind of feel guilty, and in a way I wrote the book to try and explain to the world what was really going on, and about the nature of the Russian regime.
Like you said, you visited a lot of cities, liberated cities, and Mariupol, which will be liberated, I believe, very soon. You communicated with people, you also communicated with our militaries, even our President Zelensky. Who impressed you the most, and which stories impressed you the most?
I mean, I have a whole chapter about President Zelensky called "Servant of the People," and what's interesting is actually I came to Ukraine for the election campaign in 2019 at a time when this town was not full of foreign journalists, and met some of his aides, and kind of followed his extraordinary rise. I mean, I think what is forgotten slightly is that. Just before the war, where I interacted with him at press conferences like this, asked him questions, his popularity was slightly falling, in fact. And I'm not sure if he truly believed that Russia would do a full-scale invasion, which is what the Americans and the Brits were telling him based on very concrete intelligence. We'll have to wait for his book, which I'm sure will come at some point. But what I write about is his transformation into, I would say, I call him Churchill with an iPhone, Winston Churchill with an iPhone. I mean, I think he really is probably the greatest leader in the Western world since the Second World War. And he's helped by the fact that he was an actor, an entertainer. He is the only politician I've seen who's comfortable with an iPhone, can talk convincingly into the camera, but also he has an amazing team. He has people who understand the power of story, the power of myth, and what they've been very good at communicating, Zelensky and his team, is that this is not just a conflict between two unhappy neighbors, big Russia, smaller Ukraine, that this is actually our conflict, it's our story, it's our struggle, and what happens here determines the way the world, the international order is. This is actually where I agree with Putin in some ways. It's a sort of civilizational struggle between good and evil. It couldn't be clearer. And I think Zelensky, everywhere he goes, everybody wants to meet him. I just remember one press conference with Zelensky a couple of months ago where we were sitting in the audience all trying to get a question. And a journalist from Azerbaijan got a question, and he just said, "Mr. President, my son would like me to have a selfie with you." And he just walked on stage, did the selfie, and sat down. That doesn't happen with any other politician.
But if you speak about just regular people, regular militaries, maybe you tell us some stories about these people who impressed you.
I keep coming back to Bucha. And it kind of haunts me a little bit like a nightmare. One of the women I met there was called Tatiana, and her son, well, no, not her son, actually it was her nephew, Volodymyr Chernyshenko, was a 24-year-old guy, electrician living in Bucha. And I went to go and see Tanya in early April of last year. And basically the Russians knocked on the door. Volodya handed over his phone. And they found a picture of a destroyed Russian tank, and they took him away. And so Tanya showed me where they'd taken him down the road. This is in Ivana Franka Street in Bucha. And she showed me the apple tree she had climbed up, and she looked into this house and saw the Russian soldiers torturing her nephew. They'd broken his arm, he was crying, said he hadn't done anything, didn't know anybody. And then he came out into the cold. It was a cold day, and she managed to give him a coat and some shoes, because he'd just been in his flip-flops. And they drove off and said they'd bring him back. And of course, they had no news for 3 weeks. Then the Russians withdrew at the end of March. And we went further down the road, and she showed me the basement where he'd been kept in an abandoned house. There was a mattress, there was covered in blood, there was a child's toy. They kept him there, and then one night they made him kneel and they shot him in the head. And I keep thinking about that story. We made a film about it for The Guardian. And the reason I tell it is to try and explain to the world what's going on here. You know, there were 1,600 people executed in Kiev region. There are thousands of civilians in similar circumstances. It's going on now in occupied territories. And I think even now, after 16 months of war, the West still doesn't fully understand what's going on.
I think it wasn't easy to write this book. What was the most difficult thing while you're writing?
I mean, the writing is the easy bit. Actually, I find writing quite easy. It kind of comes to me. I don't know. It's like a kind of. I can just do it. Basically, what was hard was just some of the stories, and of course you don't want life to be gloomy. And there are by the way, there are some funny moments in the book as well. I mean, for example, one row I always have with my Ukrainian friends, I have many friends here, is about Boris Johnson. Because they will say, oh, Boris Johnson, we love him, he's wonderful. And I say, no, he ruined my country, he's a liar, he's a cheat, he's a nightmare, he's an embarrassment. And they go, no, you're wrong. And I have the conversation. I get into a taxi in Kiev, and there's a rap song with Boris Johnson in the chorus line going, Dobry dzień, everybody. You know, I go just around the corner from here, there's an art gallery with Cossack art, and there's Boris Johnson dressed as a Cossack warrior playing a lute. You know, I mean, you cannot escape the man. I went to Kryvyi Rih, Zelensky's hometown, to talk to Zelensky's professors, and I stopped because there was a woman from Odessa painting a 40-foot Boris Johnson mural. I mean, in my country, he's a zero. In your country, he's a hero, and this is the only thing we disagree on.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you some little break, and I have some questions for Світлана. Please give her a mic. Світлана, розкажіть, чому видавництво обрало саме цю книгу для видавництва? Тому що
Miss Svetlana, can you please tell us why has the editorial chosen this book? Now many authors write about Ukraine, including the foreign authors. How is this book different from other books in terms of its views of Ukraine? Well, it's my honor to have having trusted us the edition and issue of this book. We found out that he was writing about the invasion. We wrote to him, and what was I surprised with, it was his immediate response. He told us he would be in Kharkiv, and he was able to meet a part of our team who were based in Kharkiv. Our editorial is based, our publishing house is based in Kharkiv, and the first horrible month of the war, first horrible month of the shellings, we were experiencing all those shellings, and we were humbled by Luke's desire to write this book, and we were also very humbled by his bravery when he was not scared about going to Kharkiv, not to go too close to the front lines. So our team met him. We presented him a hoodie that he immediately put on. In exchange, he gifted us his book about the Kremlin mafia, and our team got extremely fond by Luke as a person, as a personality. We've realized that his text would be very empathetic, that it would be of real high quality, and we've immediately realized that he has this immense expertise, the background that many authors lack. I mean, those who try to describe the events unfolding in Ukraine from outside. Luke clearly realizes who is our enemy, and what's precious to us is that he tries to communicate it to the Western audience, because we in Ukraine, or I hope that the majority of Ukrainians now realize whom we're facing, and it's very good that through his book Luke tries to convince the Western world about that. And we think that this book would be extremely interesting both in Ukraine, and again I want to reiterate it, that unlike other books that were created since the beginning of the full-scale invasion or being created now, this book is based on the profound expertise of the author, and that's on one hand, and on the other hand it's a very interesting way of reporting. It's a bit traumatic for Ukrainians, because they will realize that their experiences are described there, but without that we cannot document moments that we experience. And our goal, the goal of Vivat, of publishing house, is the creation of the maximum number of books about our war, so that the future generations can study this period by those books. And the meaning of Luke's book is extremely important in this regard. And again, it's a great honor for us to publish this book. Thank you. So what are the distribution plans? Can Ukrainians buy this book in every corner of our country? Well, it goes without saying. I hope that, well, first of all, I want to say that Luke presents this book both in Kiev and in Kharkiv in our bookstores, and we're humbled by the fact that it's about to happen in Kharkiv too, regardless the fact that Kharkiv is less safe and secure than Kiev now. But we also would like to present this book in Lviv, so we want people in all parts of Ukraine to find out about this book, and we want Luke to tell the readers about this book himself, so it will be available everywhere in Ukraine. And for what we know, it's already published in a number of languages, which humbles me too, because we want the maximum number of the people all around the world to know the truth about what's going on here in Ukraine. So I will be getting back to Luke with my questions.
Tell us, please, on your opinion, how will this book be interesting to Ukrainians and to the Western readers?
I mean, I hope it's interesting for both. I mean, in a way, it is a bit strange for me as a kind of foreign author to be writing about a book in Ukraine when there are so many brilliant brilliant Ukrainian writers and novelists and poets. But I mean, I think what I bring to it is I bring a sort of profound understanding of Russia. And also, I think it's very important to be clear about what's going on here. I mean, I'm not shy about saying that what's happening in Russia is fascism. Actually, that this is an attempt to turn Ukraine back into a colony, and also to kind of de-Ukrainize Ukraine, to remove your language, your culture, your history, your way of life. And we've seen nothing like this since the 1930s. I mean, it's absolutely genocidal, with kids being kidnapped. And in a way, I guess what I try and do is to try and explain how Vladimir Putin thinks. It's not that I've met him and spent hours in his dacha. It's that I know the people around him, I know his agencies from the inside, and I know how he thinks. And basically his view is that Ukrainians can be made into good Russians, or they can be destroyed. That those are the options. It's a completely uncompromising view. And he sees himself as someone who is not destroying things, but is restoring this lost historical, spiritual Russian space. Now, it's crazy, it's a nonsense, it's dangerous, but I think you need to understand the ideas, or the kind of pseudo-ideas, to understand the man, and that perhaps is what I do for Ukrainian readers. For Western readers, I hope I bring context, I bring light, I bring empathy, I bring humor, and most importantly, communicate the idea that, you know, but for a quirk of geography, this could be them. This could be their sons, their sisters, their daughters that Ukraine is not some faraway place, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, that it's a modern, thriving, cool European city with a very bright European future ahead of it. I mean, if Russia would stop, this place could be super successful in 5 seconds. But for now, we just have to stop Russia.
Yeah. We must, I think. Look, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I think you may feel you're a little bit Ukrainian now. How would we say for...
Have you seen my socks?
Yeah, definitely. What we respond for Slava Ukraina?
Героям слава, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. Did you pass this test for Palyanica?
I really can't get that right. And, sometimes I've been stopped by kids at checkpoints saying this, and I always get my Ukrainian friends to answer. So I'm not taken away and locked up.
Okay, you have some time to do it. So how did your perception of Ukraine and Ukrainians change during this time in Ukraine?
I mean, I think what's so interesting is the fact that Ukraine has been changing at light speed. Actually, it's every time I come to this country, there's something new. I mean, Ukraine has basically done 10, 20, 25 years of development in the space of 16 months, and also since 2014. I mean, bear in mind, I've been coming for a long time. I mean, I used to write about Yanukovych and his kleptocratic government. I was, in 2014, I was in Donetsk and Luhansk and watched the whole kind of covert Russian takeover unfold. Saw Denis Pushilin at his first press conference. And what was clear to me was this was absolutely a Russian project from the beginning. And without Russia, there would have been no war in the east of the country. So for me, it's a pleasure. I mean, what I've been trying to do actually is also educate myself. I've been trying to read Ukrainian culture because part of the problem, I think, is that for too long, people, universities, intellectuals have seen Ukraine as a kind of appendage of Russia. Actually, it's been through this kind of imperial lens. And, I've been reading Taras Shevchenko, I've been reading Gogol's short stories, I've been reading Sergei Zhadan, a great, I went to his literary festival in Kharkiv, actually, and I've been reading poetry, I've been reading Serhii Plokhy's history, I've been reading all of Andrei Kurkov's books, and I think what's interesting is there's been a kind of rebasing, if you understand, from Moscow to Kiev. My newspaper, The Guardian, we have no correspondents in Russia. They all left after Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal guy, was arrested outrageously 2 months ago. But we have a big team in Kiev. We have correspondents who come, we have people who love this place. We keep coming back. And one thing, when I decided I was going to write this book, I made a kind of promise to myself that I would keep going here and report the story for as long as it took, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 5 years.
Yeah, thank you. In your opinion, how the Western world's perception did change during all this time? So it's almost 1.5 years. It definitely changed, but you, like a person from Western world, what would you say? How did?
I mean, I write a lot in the book about international relations. I have a chapter called The Allies. And what I say is that unthinkable things have happened. If you go back 2 years, I mean, in brief summary, that the Germans abandoned pacifism, the Finns and the Swedes are joining NATO, the Swedes probably next week. The UK, which after Brexit, didn't want to talk to its European neighbours, is talking to Europe again. Poland, which traditionally didn't like refugees, has taken millions of Ukrainian refugees. There's been, I would say, a kind of rejuvenation of the West, an understanding that, as I said, that Ukraine's struggle is their struggle. NATO has been, it's as if NATO has drunk an energy drink. It's finally woken up. It realizes what is going on. And I think this was, I mean, Putin made very many mistakes, but this was a big one. He thought he could take the whole of Ukraine and the West would complain and do nothing, and that he would seize Kiev, this town, in 3 days. In reality, Western support for Ukraine has been very solid. It's continuing. And people talk about Ukraine fatigue, but I don't see it. I go around the UK, I go around villages in the middle of the countryside. I see Ukrainian flags flying from medieval stone churches built in the 15th century in a way I've never seen before. I think there is enormous grassroots support for Ukraine, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon.
So, any plans to write a new book about Ukraine? Maybe about victory of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. So this book has got a new. There's a paperback edition. The English language paperback edition has just come out with a new chapter. It was just shortlisted for a big prize in the UK, named after George Orwell for political writing. So that has come out. I have to tell you, Svetlana, I am a little bit tired, like everybody. I'm not sure I can immediately produce another book by the end of the year, but I tell you the book I would like to write, and that would be called Downfall, about the end of the Putin regime and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I think that is the next chapter. I mean, I compare Putin to, if it's a sort of Shakespearean play, it's a tragedy, but we are near the end of Putin. This is Act 5. Scene 1 or Scene 2, and we had a taste with the Prigozhin mutiny of how it might end, but my sense is that this regime is very brittle in Moscow, and I don't know how long it'll last. And I would like to, I mean, I'm banned from Russia for life, but I would like to be there when it collapses.
I would definitely read this book. Yeah, thank you. Maybe we have some questions from journalists.
First off, big respect for Luke. He's one of the few experts on this topic that Americans in the West should be listening to, which leads to my question. So what would you say to journalists who arrived in the last year, or even some that arrived in the last several months, that they should keep in mind when they're covering the conflict here? Because the initial coverage during the invasion, I remember that Kachenko was telling CNN, Alex Marquardt, last February 9th in Avdiivka, could you please stop saying separatist-controlled regions first before we get anywhere? So do you see the way in which the West has covered the conflict in the last year and the way it goes forward that people should keep in mind when they're doing this job?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think I would say, generally, not naming names, I think generally, actually, the Western reporting has been pretty good. And I think we all learned a while ago to spell Kiev K-Y-I-V, right? I had quite a long struggle at the beginning of the war over how to spell Chernobyl with an O and not an E. And we got there. And now at The Guardian, we've adapted Russian spellings. We've got rid of Russian spellings, adapted Ukrainian spellings. We have the largest map of Ukraine I've ever seen. It's about 2 meters long on the wall of our newsroom. And we try and get it right. I mean, do we always get it right? No, we don't. Some of the people I interviewed for the book changed the way they spelled their names while I was writing the book. I mean, there's been a big shift in this town, particularly away from Russian to Ukrainian. I mean, Ukraine is Ukrainizing, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to report on that. My worry is that not so much about getting it wrong, it's more about keeping going. This looks like a long war. Wars are expensive. And I would just hope that Western media companies see that Ukraine is a priority, biggest war in Europe for 80 years, and they continue to send people and they continue to cover it.
So, Luke, Svetlana, thank you very much for this conversation. And Luke, thank you for telling the truth, the whole world about this terrible war in Ukraine. I truly believe to read your book about end of Putin's regime very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you. Thank you.
Медіацентр України, Укрінформ продовжує.
Ukraine Медіацентр Укрінформ is about to continue its operation on Monday, so stay tuned and glory to Ukraine.